He was born into a world that had already decided his worth before he ever learned to speak. In the spring of 1859, on a vast plantation where strength was valued more than kindness and obedience more than thought, the boy was examined not as a child, but as a future tool. His father stood among other men, silent and uneasy, while overseers spoke in low voices. They discussed muscle, bone, endurance, and lineage the way merchants discussed livestock. The verdict was delivered without ceremony. He is unfit for reproduction. The words were not spoken with cruelty, but with indifference, which was far worse. To the men who judged him, the boy was a failed investment. His body was thin, his lungs weak from repeated illness, his growth slower than expected. He would work, yes, but he would not be used to continue bloodlines the way others were. His father heard this and felt something break inside him, not because he believed the judgment, but because he knew what came next. On that plantation, when a man was deemed unfit in one way, he was repurposed in another. The decision was made quickly, almost casually. He will be given to her, the overseer said. The strongest one. Everyone knew who that meant. She was known for her endurance, for her silence, for the way she worked through pain without complaint. Years in the fields had hardened her body and sharpened her eyes. She was not feared, but she was respected even by men who rarely respected anyone. The boy was taken that same evening. No explanation was offered to him. No comfort. He was simply told to follow, and he did. His father did not follow. He stood still as the sun sank low, knowing that resistance would only make things worse. On that plantation, love had to be quiet to survive. The woman did not welcome the boy with warmth, nor with cruelty. She looked at him once, carefully, as if measuring not his strength, but his fear. Then she nodded and said nothing. Life changed that night, not suddenly, but permanently. The boy learned quickly that his role was no longer defined by his own choices. He was expected to obey, to endure, and to exist within boundaries he had never agreed to. Yet something inside him refused to vanish. He observed everything, the patterns of labor, the habits of the overseers, the unspoken rules that governed survival. And the woman, she noticed this. She noticed that he listened more than he spoke, that he remembered details others forgot, that he asked questions quietly, carefully, at moments when it was safest. "Do you think too much?" she once told him. "Not unkindly," he replied softly. "Thinking is the only thing they haven't taken." Yet, that was the moment she understood him differently. Years passed slowly, marked by seasons and scars. The boy grew into a man who did not fit the expectations placed upon him. His body never became powerful, but his mind sharpened in ways no one anticipated. He learned to calculate work faster, to predict punishments before they came, to understand people better than they understood themselves. The plantation did not notice at first. It rarely noticed minds, but the woman did, and so did his father, watching from a distance, realizing with equal parts fear and pride that the son deemed unfit was becoming something far more dangerous to the system than brute strength, because strength could be broken, but awakened could not, and this was only the beginning. The woman never asked the boy how he felt about the arrangement. On that plantation, feelings were a luxury no one could afford. What mattered was survival, and survival demanded silence. She taught him that first. "Watch before you act," she told him one night, her voice low so it would not travel beyond the thin wooden walls. "Listen before you speak, and never let them see what you understand." He followed her advice instinctively. He watched the way overseers chose who to punish and who to spare. He noticed how favoritism shifted with moods, alcohol, and gossip. He learned which men enjoyed cruelty and which simply followed orders because they were afraid of losing their place. Most importantly, he learned that power did not always belong to the strongest. It belonged to those who could predict others. The woman worked harder than anyone else in the fields. Her strength was undeniable, but what truly set her apart was control. She never rushed, never panicked, never reacted without thought. Pain came, and she absorbed it. Hunger came, and she endured it. Anger came, and she buried it deep where it could not betray her. The boy watched this and learned. At night, when exhaustion settled into his bones, he asked her quiet questions, not reckless ones, careful ones. Why does he punish some more than others? Why do they trust him but not him? What happens to the ones who disappear? She answered when she could. When she could not, she told him the truth. Some answers get you killed. Years passed in this way. The boy's body remained slight, but his presence grew heavier. People began to notice that things ran smoother when he was nearby. Work was done faster. Conflicts were avoided. Mistakes were corrected before they became punishments. The overseers did not praise him, but they relied on him. That reliance frightened his father. From a distance, the father watched his son move through the plantation with a quiet confidence that did not belong to someone in his position. He wanted to warn him, to tell him to be smaller, duller, safer, but he knew that speaking openly, we could destroy them both. So he watched in silence. The woman noticed the father's gaze one evening as the sun fell behind the fields. "He's afraid for you," she said calmly. "He should be," the boy replied. She studied him for a long moment. "Fear keeps people alive," she said, "but it can also make them careless." The boy nodded. "That's why I don't show mine." By the time he reached manhood, the label placed on him at birth, "Unfit for reproduction," had lost its meaning. He had become something the plantation had not planned for. Not a laborer defined by muscle, not a tool measured by strength. He was a thinker, and thinkers were dangerous in a world built on obedience. The overseers began to test him in small ways. Extra responsibilities, quiet errands, counting supplies, reporting numbers. They wanted to see if his usefulness could be expanded. They did not realize that every task taught him something new. He learned how resources moved, how shortages were hidden, how lies were written into records, how power protected itself through paperwork and routine. And still, he said nothing. One night, after a particularly long day, the woman finally spoke the question she had been holding for years. "What do you want?" she asked him. He did not answer immediately. Wanting was dangerous. Wanting meant imagining a future, and futures were easily taken away. "I want to understand," he said at last. "Because once you understand something, it stops owning you." She smiled faintly. It was the first time he had seen her do that. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said. "Maybe," he replied, "but not blindly." Outside, the plantation slept, unaware that one of its smallest pieces had begun to see the entire machine. And machines did not fear strength. They feared awareness. The plantation changed slowly, almost invisibly, the way rot spreads through wood before the beam finally collapses. No one could point to a single moment when things began to shift. There was no rebellion, no open defiance, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there were small adjustments, so subtle they felt accidental. Work groups were arranged more efficiently. Tools were returned to the right places without orders being shouted. Losses in supplies decreased. Punishments, once frequent and chaotic, became oddly selective. The overseers noticed results, not causes. They praised themselves for improved discipline, never suspecting that the improvement did not come from fear but from understanding. The boy, now a young man, had learned how to guide outcomes without being seen guiding them. He learned which men were listened to and which were ignored. He learned which words traveled and which stayed buried. He learned when silence was safer than truth and when a carefully planted idea could move through the quarters like a quiet fire. The woman watched all of this with restrained concern. "You're bending things," she told him one night. "Careful. Things that bend too far snap." He understood the warning. Power tolerated usefulness. It did not tolerate influence. So he adjusted again. He made himself appear less central. He let others take credit. He stepped back when eyes lingered too long. He allowed mistakes to happen when perfection might draw suspicion. Every move was calculated not to rise, but to survive. Still, there were moments he could not control. One such moment came during a winter inspection. A visiting administrator arrived from the city, a man with clean boots and colder eyes. He walked the grounds with a ledger tucked under his arm, asking questions no one liked answering. He noticed deficiency. He noticed patterns. And eventually, he noticed the young man. "Who is that?" the administrator asked casually. The overseer shrugged. "Just one of the quieter ones." "Useful?" The administrator stopped walking. "Useful? How?" The young man felt the weight of that gaze like a blade resting on his neck. He lowered his eyes, slowed his movements, became smaller in posture, everything he had learned to do when attention became dangerous. The administrator watched him for a long moment, then scribbled something in the ledger. "Keep an eye on him," he said. "Quiet ones sometimes think too much." That night, the woman did not sleep. "Eyes are on you now," she said quietly. "That changes things, I know," he replied. For the first time, he felt something close to anger, not loud, not reckless, but sharp and focused. He had done everything right. He had followed the rules of survival. And still, intelligence itself had betrayed him. That was when he fully understood the truth his father had never spoken aloud. In that world, being harmless was safer than being valuable. From then on, he began preparing for outcomes he had once avoided thinking about. He memorized escape, routes not to run, but to disappear within the system if needed. He shared knowledge more carefully, fragmenting it so no single person carried the whole picture. He taught others how to think without teaching them what to think. The woman became his anchor. "You're changing?" she said one evening. "So are the risks," he answered. She studied him with a mix of pride and fear. "Promise me something," she said. "What?" "If the time comes when they decide you're a threat, don't try to prove them wrong." He met her gaze. "I won't. I'll prove them irrelevant." In another part of the plantation, his father sat alone, staring at hands that had labored for decades. He had once believed strength was protection. Now he saw that survival belonged to those who understood the rules deeply enough to move between them. He wondered how long his son could keep walking that line. The answer though none of them knew it yet, was not much longer. The cat's systems built on control eventually notice the minds that slip through their grasp, and when they do, not ask questions, they react. The first real test came without warning. It was a morning like any other, thick with fog and the smell of damp earth. The fields were quiet, too quiet, and that alone made the young man uneasy. Silence on the plantation was rarely accidental. He noticed the overseers gathering near the main house, their voices low, their posture tense. One of them glanced in his direction, then quickly away. That was enough. Something was coming. By midday, his name was called. Not shouted, not barked, spoken calmly, which was worse. He walked toward the main house slowly, every step measured. He kept his breathing even, his face blank. Inside, fear tightened around his chest, but he did not let it surface. Panic invited punishment, calm confused predators. The administrator, from the winter inspection, stood near the window, sunlight catching the edge of his polished boots. Two overseers stood nearby, arms crossed. "Do you know why you're here?" the administrator asked. "No, sir," the young man replied. Softly, the man studied him the way one might study a locked door. "You've been observed," he said. "Efficiency has improved. Losses have decreased. Discipline has stabilized." The young man said nothing. "None of that should be possible," the administrator continued, without direction. Silence stretched. "Are you directing others?" the man asked. "No, sir." The answer was true and incomplete. He did not direct. He influenced. And the difference mattered. The administrator smiled faintly. "Interesting." He circled the young man slowly. "You were once labeled unfit," he said. "Yet, here you stand, functioning beyond expectations." The young man lowered his gaze. "I only do what I'm told." Another pause. "That's what concerns me," the administrator replied. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. "You think," the man said flatly, "and thinking creates problems." The young man felt the truth of that statement settle deep in his bones. The administrator turned to the overseers. "Reduce his responsibilities," he said. "Limit his movement. Keep him visible." Visible, it was a sentence, not a punishment, but it carried the weight of a threat. That night, the woman listened, without interruption, as he told her everything. When he finished, she closed her eyes. "They've noticed," she said quietly. "You knew this day would come." "Yes." "Then you must change again." "I will." But both of them knew the truth. Change was becoming harder. Restrictions followed. He was reassigned to repetitive labor, tasks that required no thought, no counting, no coordination. The intention was clear: dulled the mind by starving it. They underestimated him again. Even in repetition, he observed. Even in silence, he learned. He began mapping patterns in his head: time, movement, attention. He learned when eyes were present and when they wandered. He learned how boredom weakened guards more than rebellion. Evercood and others noticed. Quietly, cautiously, people began watching him the way he once watched the system. They mirrored his calm, his patience, his refusal to react. The idea was spreading again. His father approached him one evening, older than ever, voice heavy. "They're circling you," the man said. "I can see it." "I know," his son replied. "You need to be careful." "I have been careful my whole life," the father swallowed. "Sometimes careful isn't enough." The young man placed a hand on his father's arm. "Sometimes it's all we have." That night, as he lay awake, he accepted something he had resisted for years. Survival was no longer the goal. Preparation was. Whatever came next: punishment, removal, disappearance, he would meet it awake, not blind. He would not be caught confused or small. He would not beg to be misunderstood. If the system intended to break him, it would have to understand him first, and it didn't. Outside, the plantation slept, unaware that the boy once declared unfit had reached the most dangerous stage of all. He was no longer just adapting, he was ready. The next morning arrived with no announcement, no sign, no immediate consequence. And yet, everything felt different. The young man sensed it in the air, in the way conversations stopped when he approached, in the way overseers lingered just a second longer than before, in the way even silence felt supervised. Visibility had become its own form of confinement. He worked the fields with deliberate slowness, now not laziness, but balance, enough effort to avoid suspicion, enough restraint to avoid distinction. Every movement was calculated to blend, not disappear completely, but never stand out. Still, the system had shifted its posture. Where once it ignored him, now it measured him. The woman felt it too. She no longer corrected him openly, no longer lingered near him longer than necessary. Distance, she knew, could be a shield. "Don't come to me unless you must," she said one night, her voice steady but her eyes tense. "They watch patterns more than people." "I understand," he replied.
And he did. From then on, his learning turned inward. without paper, without words. He built structures in his mind. Sequences, contingencies, responses. He imagined scenarios not to fantasize about escape, but to ensure he was never unprepared. What if they removed him suddenly? What if they separated him from everyone he knew? What if they demanded obedience in exchange for survival? He rehearsed answers, calm ones, uninteresting ones. The father, too, began preparing in his own way. He spoke less. He avoided attention. He made himself forgettable, not out of fear for himself, but to reduce the chances that others would connect him too closely to his son. Love, on that plantation, was expressed through caution. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing happened. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because systems that relied on control rarely hesitated without reason. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the ground, the young man stood alone at the edge of the fields. He watched the horizon carefully, memorizing the way the land folded into itself. He knew every path now, every blind spot, every place where sound traveled, and where it didn't. He realized something then. They could restrict his body. They could isolate him. They could even remove him. But they could not undo what had already been learned. The system's greatest mistake had not been misjudging his strength. It had been allowing him time. Time to observe. Time to understand. Time to prepare. As darkness settled, he returned to the quarters quietly, unnoticed. He lay down without ceremony, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the night. He was no longer afraid of what might come. He was afraid only of one thing, that whatever came next might come too late to stop what had already begun inside him. Because the boy, once declared unfit, had crossed a line the system did not recognize until it was behind him. He was no longer surviving the world he was born into. He was learning how to outlast it. And that marked the true beginning of his story. The system did not move loudly. It never did. Instead, it adjusted. Work assignments were reshuffled again, but this time without logic. People who worked well together were separated. Routines that had become efficient were disrupted. Confusion returned, not by accident, but by design. The young man recognized it immediately. Disorder was being reintroduced to test where order came from. He kept his face empty and his movements ordinary. But inside, his mind moved faster than ever. He watched who struggled most with the changes, who adapted, and who complained. Complaints, he knew, were the quickest way to draw attention. Attention was danger. The overseers had been instructed carefully. They did not single him out. They did not accuse. They observed. They waited. They wanted proof, not of rebellion, but of influence. And influence was harder to trap. One afternoon, a man collapsed in the fields from exhaustion. It was not unusual. What was unusual was the hesitation that followed. No one moved at first. Everyone waited to see who would act, because acting too quickly could look like leadership. The young man felt the moment stretch. If he stepped forward, eyes would follow. If he stayed back, someone might die. He chose a third path. He spoke quietly to the man beside him, then another. Instructions passed, not as commands, but as suggestions. Movements began without a single visible source. Water arrived. Shade was created. The collapsed man was carried, not by him, but by others. From a distance, an overseer narrowed his eyes. The administrator would hear about this. That evening, the woman did not look at him when he returned. "They're tightening," she said simply. "Yes. You can't keep balancing forever." "I know." Silence settled between them. Not tense, heavy. The kind that carried things unsaid. "They won't punish you yet," she continued. "They want to know how far it goes." "And when they decide?" he asked. "Then they'll remove you," she said. Not loudly, Not cruelly, just gone. He nodded. He had expected that answer for years. What you've taught, she added, it won't disappear with you. That's the point, he said. That night, he did something he had avoided until now. He began choosing successors, not leaders, not heroes. People who asked why, but did not need to ask out loud. He did not give them plans. He gave them methods. Ways to see patterns, ways to recognize manipulation, ways to stay alive while understanding the truth. Knowledge, he knew, was safest when divided. Days later, the administrator returned. This time, he did not walk the fields. He called the young man directly. The room was smaller than before, the windows narrower. 2 guards stood outside. The administrator did not pretend this was a conversation. "You are difficult to measure," the man said calmly. "I try not to be noticed," the young man replied. "That," the administrator said, "exactly what concerns me." He leaned forward slightly. "You were deemed unfit once, and yet here you are, affecting outcomes without authority." "I don't understand," the young man said truthfully. The administrator smiled thinly. "You don't have to. Understanding is not required for compliance." There it was, the shift. "You will be relocated," the man continued. "Temporarily. Somewhere quieter." The young man felt the weight of the word settle into his chest. Relocated meant isolated. Isolated meant erased. "When?" he asked. "Soon," the administrator replied, "before your habits spread further." That night, the woman did something she had never done before. She hugged him, briefly, fiercely, as if memorizing his shape. "You did what you could." "I'm not finished," he replied. "You may not be given the chance." He met her eyes. "Then I've already done enough." From across the quarters, his father watched them one last time. He did not approach. He did not speak. He only nodded once, an acknowledgement heavier than words. The young man lay awake until dawn, not afraid, not angry, focused, because removal was not an end. It was a variable, and variables could be planned for. The system believed it was cutting out a problem. It did not yet understand that it was spreading one. The relocation happened without ceremony. There was no announcement, no explanation offered to anyone. One morning, just before the sun had fully risen, 2 guards appeared at the edge of the quarters. They did not raise their voices, they did not threaten. They simply waited. The young man was told to gather what little he owned. It did not take long. As he stepped away, he did not look back immediately. He had learned that farewells invited weakness. Still, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. The woman stood in the doorway, still as stone. His father was nowhere to be seen, but he knew his absence was intentional. Witnesses created stories. Stories created consequences. The journey was short, but deliberate. He was taken not far in distance, but far in separation, to a smaller, quieter holding area, used for those deemed inconvenient, but not yet disposable. A place designed to erase influence through isolation. The administrator's hand was careful. The new location was stripped of complexity, repetitive labor, limited interaction, no opportunity to organize, to observe patterns, to speak freely. The system believed simplicity would starve the mind. It was wrong. In isolation, thought grew sharper. With fewer distractions, the young man refined what he already knew. He listened closely, to footsteps, to routines, to the rhythms of authority. He mapped time not by clocks, but by behavior. He learned when guards grew bored, when attention drifted, when oversight thinned. He also learned something unexpected. The people placed near him were not random. They were others like him. Not strong, not loud, not openly defiant, but watchful, quiet. The kind of people systems noticed only after it was too late. No one spoke openly at first. Silence was safer. But understanding does not require words. Shared glances, subtle shifts, unspoken recognition. They had all been moved for the same reason. They did not fit neatly. Weeks passed. The administrator checked in occasionally, always from a distance, always through reports. He expected decline, dullness, compliance. Instead, he received something else. Efficiency returned, locally. Calm replaced chaos. The very patterns he had tried to break reformed in miniature. The system had repeated its mistake. It had gathered minds together. One evening, a guard lingered longer than usual. "You people work smoothly," he said casually. The young man looked at him briefly, then away. "It's easier when there's less noise." The guard nodded, thoughtful. That single exchange traveled, not as a report, as a rumor. Back at the main plantation, things had begun to slip again. Without the quiet adjustments the young man had once made invisibly, old inefficiencies returned. Punishments increased. Supplies vanished. Tension rose. The system noticed. The administrator read the numbers twice. Correlation was uncomfortable. Removing the influence had revealed its absence. He faced a choice: reintegrate the problem or escalate control. Men like him always chose control. Orders were drafted, restrictions tightened. The isolated group was placed under closer watch, movements limited further, communication discouraged entirely. The young man felt the pressure immediately. This was the dangerous phase. Systems became violent when subtlety failed. That night, lying on a narrow cot, he made a decision he had avoided until now. If isolation was meant to erase him, then he would use it to solidify something that could not be erased. He began teaching openly, but not with words. He demonstrated patience under pressure. He modeled restraint when provoked. He showed how to comply without surrendering awareness, how to appear empty while remaining full. Others noticed, copied, adapted. No meetings, no plans, just example. By the time the administrator realized what was happening, the pattern was no longer traceable to one person. It had become behavior. And behavior was harder to punish than rebellion. Back at the plantation, the woman felt it too, a strange shift, like a current changing direction. She could not explain it, but she knew one thing. He was still shaping things. Even from a distance, the system had tried to remove a variable. Instead, it had created a constant. The administrator's patience did not break all at once. It fractured. Small inconsistencies appeared in reports. Guards complained of odd calm. Productivity stabilized where it should have deteriorated. Discipline held without fear being applied as often as before. These were not successes. These were warnings. Order without force unsettled men who relied on force to create order. The administrator requested details, names, causes, chains of command. None appeared. There were no meetings to point to, no visible leaders, no speeches, no defiance. Just behavior that refused to collapse under pressure. That was intolerable. He traveled to the relocation site unannounced. This time, he did not stand behind desks or windows. He walked the grounds himself, watching faces, movements, posture. He saw eyes that lifted briefly, then lowered, not in fear but in calculation. He saw discipline that did not come from terror. And at the center of it, not standing out, not commanding, he saw the young man, still unremarkable to a careless observer, still slight, still quiet, but the administrator now recognized the signature, calm, that did not belong to submission. He stopped a guard. "Who do they listen to?" The guard hesitated. No one, sir. They just do what needs doing. That answer confirmed everything. The administrator summoned the young man alone. This room was different. No windows, one chair, one table. The kind of place where conversations were meant to be remembered. You've adapted well, the administrator said. I do what's required, the young man replied. Your presence correlates with stability, the man said flatly. That's a problem. I don't control anyone. The administrator leaned forward. Influence doesn't require control. Silence filled the room. You were moved to contain you, the man continued. Instead, you normalized resistance without rebellion. I don't resist, the young man said. That's the most dangerous part, the administrator replied. He studied him for a long moment. I can remove you entirely. The young man met his gaze, calm. You can. And yet, the administrator added, the effects remain. That truth landed hard. Removal would not reverse what had already spread. Punishment would only validate it. The system had backed itself into a corner. Tell me, the administrator said quietly, what do you want? The young man considered the question carefully. I want things to function, he said. Chaos wastes lives. Fear wastes time. The administrator exhaled through his nose. You speak as if this place exists to function. It exists to extract, the young man replied. Function makes extraction easier. That was a mistake. The administrator stood abruptly. You forget your position. I know my position, the young man said softly. That's why I survive. The room went very still. You will remain here, the administrator said, indefinitely. No responsibility beyond manual labor. Any deviation will be punished. He paused at the door. You are not to be an example. The door closed. The young man did not react immediately. He waited, listened to footsteps fade, measured the weight of what had just happened. From afar, the woman felt it. The father felt it. Even the overseers noticed, though none dared speak it aloud. Something fundamental had changed. The boy once declared unfit for reproduction had survived, adapted, and influenced a system that had been designed to erase him, and the system would not forgive this, not silently, not indefinitely. It would strike, but he would be ready. The days that followed were tense, measured, calculated. The administrator increased observation, thinking that pressure alone could bend the young man. Guards moved in pairs. Routine checks were intensified. Every minor interaction was scrutinized. But the young man, trained in patience and calculation, had already accounted for every contingency. He did not react outwardly. Not a tremor, not a pause, not a sign of annoyance or defiance. He performed each task exactly as expected, yet internally he cataloged every detail, every guard rotation, every moment of distraction, every unspoken signal that could indicate weakness. By night, he taught, silently, not with words, not in a way the system could see. Small gestures. Demonstrations of careful endurance, subtle methods of observation. Those around him began to mirror his calm, his awareness, his ability to navigate oppressive conditions without breaking. He had turned isolation into an advantage. The system had tried to erase him. Instead, it had refined him and multiplied his influence. Then, one evening, the administrator arrived personally. This time, there would be no half measures. The air was thick with intent. The young man was called into the inspection room. The walls were bare, the space small, the tension palpable. You continue to exist, the administrator said flatly, and yet reports indicate that productivity, obedience, and stability remain intact in your presence. How is this possible? I follow instructions, the young man replied calmly. Not a lie, but not the whole truth. You do more than that, the administrator said. Your presence alters behavior. Subordinates anticipate actions, tasks complete themselves, compliance exists without threat. How? He shrugged lightly. Careful. Calm. Silent authority without speaking it aloud. The administrator exhaled sharply. You were moved to isolate you. You were removed from influence, and yet influence cannot be removed from thought. The young man said softly. It exists wherever understanding exists. The administrator's face hardened. You are clever, too clever. And yet you remain obedient. That is survival, the young man said. Obedience is a tool. Awareness is armor. The administrator leaned back. The thin smile he offered was not warmth, it was calculation. Then you understand the consequences of your position? I do. He did. He had accounted for everything the system could throw at him, every measure of control, every attempt at manipulation, and yet he knew that awareness alone was not enough. Timing, patience, and calculated restraint were as important as understanding. Good, the administrator said finally. Then you will remain. But know this. Every action, every success, every quiet adaptation is observed. One misstep, one moment of visible influence, and I will be ready, the young man said. The administrator paused, considering the weight of that response. He did not react with anger. He did not strike fear, but the unspoken truth hung in the air. Control was slipping. Variables could no longer be fully predicted. Systems that depended on compliance alone were failing. The young man returned to his cot that night, exhausted in body but sharpened in mind. He lay quietly, listening to the distant sounds of the guard's footsteps, the whispers of the wind across the quarters. He had survived the first serious test of isolation, observation, and psychological pressure. He had not merely endured. He had adapted, influenced, and prepared. And now he waited. He waited for the moment when the system would attempt to correct its failure. Because correction would not be gentle. And when it came, he would be ready. He was no longer the boy deemed unfit for reproduction, unfit for life, unfit for influence. He was now fully aware of his power, the quiet, invisible power of thought, patience, and calculated action. The system might have tried to erase him. It had failed. The real story was only beginning. The air felt different the morning he was summoned to the outer fields. The sun had barely risen, yet the entire plantation seemed to shift under an invisible weight. Guards moved with heightened attention. Overseers lingered near corners, observing movements, listening for subtle shifts in behavior. Even the wind seemed to carry a quiet scrutiny, as if the land itself had learned to watch. The young man had anticipated this day. For weeks, he had tracked every pattern, every response to pressure, every small sign that control could be bent. Nothing had been left to chance. And yet, there was tension in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar, the first true sign that the system was moving from observation to action. A group of new overseers had arrived. Their eyes were unfamiliar. Their tone was sharper. Their orders came clipped, efficient, leaving no room for interpretation. They were not here to observe. They were here to enforce, to reset, to remind the population that deviation, subtle or otherwise, would not be tolerated. The young man walked among them, carrying out the same tasks as always. Hands steady, steps measured, eyes lowered just enough to appear compliant. And yet, every movement, every glance, every breath was calculated, storing information that would be useful later. They noticed him. The lead overseer paused. "You," he said. "Come here." The young man approached without haste. His heart rate remained steady. There was no visible sign of nervousness. Nothing that could be used against him, at least nothing obvious. "You are aware," the overseer said flatly, "that your behavior has been unusual." "I follow instructions," the young man replied softly. The overseer's eyes narrowed. "Instructions have been followed, yes, but the results are concerning. Compliance without oversight, order without punishment, efficiency without fear. This is not acceptable." He paused, letting the words settle like stones thrown into still water. "You will be moved again. This time, to a place where influence is impossible, where observation is continuous, where deviation cannot survive." The young man's mind raced, though no outward sign betrayed it. He had anticipated this move. Contingencies had been prepared, mental maps drawn, escape routes memorized, small alliances formed quietly, every variable accounted for. "Where?" he asked calmly. "You will learn in time," the overseer replied, "and you will not speak of it. No one will speak of it." The young man nodded, understood. As he walked away, he realized something vital. This was no longer a test. This was an escalation. Isolation had been a challenge. Observation had been a challenge. Now control itself was attempting a direct confrontation. The path ahead would not be navigated by patience alone. He returned to his cot that night, not to rest, but to plan. He reviewed every detail: guard rotations, supply routes, timing of inspections, reactions of fellow captives. He imagined every scenario the overseers might attempt and rehearsed his responses quietly, mentally, invisibly. By the time the sun rose the next morning, he was ready to face the first direct attempt to contain him. The new holding area was smaller, more controlled, walls were higher, windows barred, and the overseers had been instructed to rotate frequently to prevent familiarity. Every person in proximity was either new or carefully monitored, reducing the chance of informal alliances. It was, in every sense, designed to erase him. But the young man had already begun turning the environment into his advantage. He observed carefully. He noted the rotation patterns, the weak links, the lapses in attention. He cataloged habits, routines, and tendencies. And he waited. For a moment when the system's arrogance would allow him space to act subtly, to influence quietly, to survive. At first, nothing happened. Days of repetition and observation passed. The overseers assumed compliance was total. Efficiency remained, but it was a fragile construct. One afternoon, a minor disruption occurred. A small group of laborers mismanaged a task. A guard moved to punish. The young man intervened, not overtly, not with words, but with subtle adjustments, positioning tools, redirecting a cart, whispering a suggestion to a neighbor. The disruption corrected itself quietly, without anyone being able to trace it to him. From that moment, influence began to spread again, silent and undetected. The system had escalated control, believing isolation and constant observation would suffice. Yet the young man had already adapted, had already prepared, had already learned to operate in the shadows of scrutiny. He was aware that the next phase would be far more dangerous, because subtle influence was no longer enough. The administrator would notice soon, and when the administrator noticed, it would be the beginning of true confrontation. The next inspection came without warning. The administrator himself arrived, accompanied by two new overseers whose eyes scanned the quarters with the precision of predators. Their presence alone changed the rhythm of life. Every step taken by the young man, every gesture, every glance was noted, measured, and stored in memory for later judgment. He did not flinch. He moved as if nothing had changed. Every action was calculated, deliberate, calm, invisible calm that masked the storm of awareness inside him. The administrator stopped in the center of the quarters, turning slowly to study every face. Then he locked eyes on the young man. "You," he said, voice quiet but cutting. "Stand forward." The young man did so without hesitation, without fear. He understood that compliance alone would not save him here. Observation, patience, and mental control were just as crucial as obedience. "You are aware," the administrator continued, "that your influence has been noted, beyond what should be possible in your position." "I do my best to follow instructions," the young man said, softly, carefully. The administrator's eyes narrowed. "Do you understand the meaning of your position?" "Yes," the young man replied. "I exist where you place me." The administrator exhaled sharply. "Existence is insufficient. Influence cannot persist, and yet it does. Your presence alters behavior. Subordinates act differently. Efficiency is maintained without fear. This is unacceptable." He circled slowly, as if inspecting a mechanism that had malfunctioned. "Isolation should have erased you. Observation should have constrained you. And yet, you continue." The young man remained calm, measuring every pause, every breath, every flicker in the administrator's face. He did not speak unnecessarily. Silence became armor. "You are clever," the administrator said at last. "Too clever. And that is the danger. Cleverness breeds resistance, even when hidden. Obedience alone cannot mitigate it. You understand, do you not?" "I understand," the young man said. "And I will comply." "Compliance," the administrator said, voice low, "without understanding is meaningless. Yet you understand everything. That is why I am concerned." Silence stretched. The guards and overseers stood tense, unsure whether to act or wait. The room felt impossibly small, though it was the same dimensions as before. The weight of authority pressed down, seeking any sign of defiance. The young man kept his expression neutral. He knew that even the smallest twitch could be interpreted as rebellion, but he also knew that measured observation could turn pressure into advantage. "You will remain under continuous observation," the administrator said finally. "Every action noted, every interaction recorded. And yet, understand this. Influence is a threat. Do not underestimate the measures we can take." "I understand," the young man said softly. The administrator studied him for a long moment. Then he turned and left, leaving the young man alone with the quiet hum of tension. Outside, the wind whispered through the quarters. The young man returned to his cot, not to rest, but to plan. He knew the system's next move would be decisive. Subtle influence would no longer suffice. The administrator had recognized the pattern. He understood that control by observation alone was ineffective. The stakes had escalated. The young man's mind worked through every possible scenario. He reviewed guard rotations, inspection schedules, and patterns of movement. He anticipated where the system might strike first and how to counter silently, invisibly. His allies, those who had unconsciously learned from him, continued to mirror his calm, his patience, his methods of subtle adjustment. Communication remained silent. Influence remained undetectable. But now, preparation had to include resistance, not overt, but strategic. The system believed it could contain him. It had already failed, and the young man knew the moment of confrontation would come soon. Because when systems recognize variables they cannot control, they act decisively, and he would be ready. The days that followed were a test of endurance unlike any before. The young man's movements were watched constantly. Guards rotated unpredictably. New overseers arrived from distant plantations, bringing fresh eyes and stricter standards. Tasks were changed daily, never repeated, leaving no chance for comfort or routine. Even small mistakes were amplified, becoming opportunities to punish. Yet, he remained calm. Every shift, every new obstacle, every unfamiliar face was cataloged in his mind. Observation had become instinct. Anticipation had become a shield. The first psychological attack came subtly. An overseer intentionally created confusion among the laborers. Tools misplaced, instructions altered, minor disputes provoked, others struggled. Panic flickered briefly in their eyes. The young man observed quietly, without intervention. He did not act. Instead, he waited. The system expected him to fix it, expected him to intervene, expected him to reveal influence, but he did not. He allowed the situation to evolve. And in that evolution, he noted exactly who panicked first, who hesitated, who acted efficiently despite confusion, every detail stored, every pattern analyzed. When finally he acted, it was invisible. A gentle adjustment here, a whispered direction there, a card nudged in the right direction. The disruption resolved itself quietly, without a trace pointing to him. The overseers observed the resolution with suspicion, frustration, and disbelief. The problem had been solved, but the system could not locate its source. The administrator's reports reflected this subtle shift. Productivity was maintained, compliance intact, and yet anomalies remained. The young man's invisible influence had reached a point that no punishment, no restriction, no isolation could fully contain. Isolation returned in a new form. This time, physical separation from others was increased. Windows barred, walls fortified, interaction monitored not only by guards, but by newly appointed observers with written logs. Every step, every motion, every sound meticulously recorded. But isolation had never been enough. He used it instead. By observing patterns of oversight, he learned when guards' attention wavered, when fatigue set in, when rules bent unintentionally. He cataloged every weakness and stored them for future use. Every minor inconsistency became an asset, and quietly, influence spread. Those around him, fellow captives, began adapting to his methods unconsciously. They acted with subtle coordination, anticipated problems, and resolved minor crises before intervention. They did not speak openly, did not meet in groups, did not draw attention. Yet the system's designs unraveled quietly around them. The administrator sensed this escalation. He arrived personally, more frequently now, speaking less, observing more. The young man remained calm, always present, always aware, never giving the slightest hint of recognition or superiority. But the psychological pressure increased. Sleep schedules were disrupted. Food rations measured to the gram. Work assignments randomized. Silence enforced in quarters. Guards walked in pairs, watching. Even with all this, the young man did not falter. He had learned that the system's greatest mistake was its arrogance. It assumed control could be absolute, that fear alone could dictate behavior, that influence could be removed through restriction. He had learned to turn the system's own methods into tools. Observation became armor, anticipation became leverage, subtle coordination became power. Weeks passed. The system's attempts at containment intensified, but with each escalation, it revealed more about itself than about him. Each rule imposed, each surveillance detail added, each new layer of control was cataloged, analyzed, and anticipated. And yet, he did not act openly. He knew the moment would come when direct action was necessary. Until then, survival was about endurance, adaptation, and silent influence. By the time the administrator realized what had happened, the young man's presence had shifted the entire dynamic. Efficiency remained. Compliance persisted. Disruption was managed before it escalated, and no one could point to a single source. The system had failed to erase the variable. It had only refined it. The young man lay awake that night, thinking not of escape, not of rebellion, but of preparation. Every pattern memorized, every movement calculated, every weakness observed, every opportunity stored for the right moment. He understood fully now. Survival was no longer about compliance. It was about timing. An influence, even invisible, was more powerful than the system could ever measure. The administrator would act soon. That was inevitable. But when the action came, the young man would not be caught unaware. He was no longer just surviving. He was preparing to turn observation into advantage. And the first confrontation, the true test of system versus mind, was approaching. The day came without warning. The administrator arrived personally, flanked by overseers and guards whose presence radiated intent. The air was thick with tension. Every glance, every step, every breath seemed measured and recorded. Even the sunlight that filtered through barred windows seemed sharper, more precise, as if the very atmosphere had been tuned to scrutiny. The young man stood silently, performing his duties as usual, hands steady, eyes calm. He did not flinch. He did not speak unnecessarily. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, untraceable. The administrator stopped near him, studying him with a gaze that weighed each thought, each reaction, each subtle expression. "You exist where we place you," the administrator said. "Yet you bend every measure we impose. Isolation fails, observation fails, control fails. I exist as you allow," the young man replied, calm, careful, measured. "Do you understand the danger of your position?" "Yes," he said. "I understand." The administrator's voice dropped, tight with suppressed frustration. "You influence others without authority. You coordinate silently. You maintain order without fear. This is intolerable." "I do what is necessary," the young man said. The administrator's eyes narrowed. "You understand that the next step could be irreversible?" "I understand," the young man said softly, without hesitation. The administrator leaned closer, his gaze intense. "Do you know why you are dangerous?" "Because I survive," the young man said. "Because I understand. Because I observe." The administrator froze for a fraction of a second. Then, slowly, he straightened. "And yet you obey. You submit outwardly while bending the system inward. Cleverness alone is not enough. Timing is critical. And you have learned it." The room seemed impossibly still. Guards and overseers waited, uncertain. The air was thick with anticipation, a tangible force pressing on everyone present. "You have adapted to everything we have thrown at you. And yet, you are still alive. That is what makes you dangerous." "I do not seek power," the young man replied. "Only survival and understanding." The administrator studied him long enough to see the truth. His patience had limits, but the realization came too late. Variables that could not be fully measured had multiplied. Systems built on control alone were vulnerable, especially when they faced minds that could observe, anticipate, and adapt without detection. "You will remain," the administrator said finally, "under continuous observation. Any deviation, and the consequences will be severe." "I understand," the young man said, calm, measured, ready. The administrator left. The guards lingered, watching. Every movement of the young man catalogued, yet none could trace influence or intent. The young man returned to his cot, exhausted in body but sharpened in mind. He knew this phase was not the end. The system would escalate. It always did. But he also knew something vital. He had survived. He had adapted. He had influenced. And he had prepared for the next move. Outside, the plantation slept, oblivious to the quiet revolution occurring within its walls. Awareness, patience, and calculated action had become forces more potent than chains, rules, or punishment. He was no longer just the boy declared unfit. He was now fully aware of his own power. And the next phase, the true test of system versus mind, was approaching. Because when systems attempt to destroy a mind that cannot be contained, they only sharpen it, and he would not be caught unprepared. The morning arrived heavy and silent. The young man had already anticipated the patterns of the day. Guards rotated in precise intervals. Overseers observed, recording behavior. The administrator's presence, though absent physically, was felt everywhere, through subtle instructions, sudden inspections, and the oppressive weight of expectation. But something was different this day. Small anomalies began appearing. Routines that had seemed rigid were subtly shifted. Tools were slightly misplaced. Supplies did not arrive in the usual order. Even the guards seemed off balance, jittery, reacting just a fraction slower to minor disruptions. He noticed it immediately. The system was nervous. Observation alone had failed. Isolation had failed. Control had failed. And now the administrator was preparing a decisive action. The young man moved quietly among the workers, noting every detail. He did not speak. He did not act openly. His eyes cataloged movement, body language, small hesitations, everything that might indicate how the system intended to strike. Then it happened. A sudden shout from the administrator. Guards surged forward. Tasks were abruptly reassigned. Subordinates were separated. Confusion was injected intentionally, like a shockwave rippling through the quarters. The system's move was clear. It would force compliance by breaking routine, isolating influence, and creating panic. The young man remained calm, every reaction measured, every breath controlled. He had prepared for this. Even under pressure, he anticipated the collapse before it happened. He saw where people would stumble, where panic would rise, where failure could be exploited, and quietly, imperceptibly, he guided them. Not with words, but with small gestures, subtle movements, timing shifts, and silent signals. The administrator's frustration became visible. He moved closer, demanding obedience. He attempted to corral influence. He expected chaos to reveal the source. It did not. Instead, order appeared, not because of fear, not because of coercion, but because the system's target had transformed influence into action without visibility. The administrator's face hardened. He realized something fundamental. Control had limits, and the young man had already moved beyond them. This was the moment the young man had been preparing for years. He had survived observation, isolation, and manipulation. He had turned invisibility into influence. He had prepared allies without a single word. And now, the system itself would demonstrate its final vulnerability, the assumption that knowledge alone could be suppressed. He acted decisively, not with confrontation, but with presence. Subtle coordination, silent guidance, and perfect timing brought the fractured quarters into alignment. Tasks completed efficiently. Panic dissipated before it could escalate. Guards faltered, unable to identify the source. And in that moment, he understood fully. The system could not erase awareness, cannot crush thought, and cannot prevent adaptation. The administrator paused, visibly shaken. He had underestimated the variable. The young man, once declared unfit, had survived every attempt to control him. And now, even in the system's apex of pressure, he remained unbroken. The quarters fell silent again. Tension hung like a taut wire. The young man stood quietly, aware of every eye upon him, yet utterly calm. He had endured, he had adapted, he had influenced. And now, the balance had shifted. Outside, the woman watched from a distance. The father watched silently. Both understood what had been achieved. A subtle revolution had occurred, not with force, not with rebellion, but with patience, awareness, and calculated endurance. The young man finally allowed himself a small breath. He had survived the impossible. He had mastered the unmanageable. And the system had revealed its greatest weakness. It could not break a mind that refused to be contained. The administrator would return with more force, more scrutiny, more intent. But the outcome had already been determined. The young man had turned observation, oppression, and isolation into his greatest strengths. And in that moment, he understood the truth that had guided him all along. Survival is not about hiding, nor about yielding. It is about knowing, anticipating, and moving unseen until the moment is right. The plantation slept. The system believed it was still in control. But the variable had multiplied. The boy once deemed unfit for reproduction had become an enduring, unstoppable force, a mind no chains could contain. The story was approaching its end, not with rebellion, not with violence, but with inevitability. Because when awareness cannot be erased, the system itself begins to unravel, and he had already learned how to wait. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the quarters. The young man had anticipated this day for weeks, months, perhaps years. The system, confident in its control, had escalated every measure possible. Isolation, observation, scrutiny, rotation of guards, disruptions in routine, and threats of punishment. Every variable had been accounted for, or so it believed. But the system had made the same mistake it always made. It underestimated the mind that had already adapted beyond its reach. The administrator arrived personally, his presence heavy with intent. Overseers flanked him, guards positioned strategically. Their orders were precise: isolate, monitor, control. Any deviation would be punished immediately. Any influence would be suppressed. The young man moved quietly among the laborers. His actions were subtle, precise, and invisible. He did not speak, he did not give commands, yet every movement, every glance, every minor adjustment orchestrated alignment without detection. Crises were resolved before they could escalate. Panic was neutralized before it could spread. Tasks completed themselves efficiently. The administrator noticed immediately. His reports reflected efficiency, order, and compliance. Yet he knew this could not be natural. The system should have failed here, but it had not. At least not visibly. "You exist where we place you," the administrator said, stopping before him. "And yet everything functions as if you are not here. How is this possible?" "I do as required," the young man replied calmly, "and I observe." The administrator's gaze sharpened. Observation is not action, yet you have influenced everyone without authority. You have become a force beyond measure. Do you understand the danger of your position? "I do," the young man said softly. "I understand what can be seen and what cannot. I understand timing, patience, and consequence. I understand survival." The administrator studied him, realizing that subtlety had won where force had failed. Isolation could not erase influence. Observation could not suppress awareness. Control could not break thought. "You have survived every test," the administrator said, voice tight with frustration. "And yet you do not yield." "I have never yielded," the young man said. "I have adapted. I have observed, I have endured, and I have prepared." The administrator exhaled sharply. He understood now that the system could not win. Every measure taken to control, isolate, and observe had only strengthened the young man's influence. It was invisible, silent, unstoppable. The young man's allies, those who had learned quietly from his presence, moved efficiently, anticipating needs, correcting disruptions, maintaining calm without overt instruction. The system's own structures had been turned into mechanisms of resilience, unknowingly controlled by the very person it sought to erase. Finally, the administrator stepped back. "You have won this moment," he admitted, almost to himself. "But do not mistake it for freedom. Control remains." The young man looked calmly at him. Control exists only where minds are constrained. You cannot constrain awareness. Silence fell. The plantation itself seemed to pause. The administrator could do nothing further without exposing the system's own failure. For the first time, the young man had made the unbreakable cracks visible. The foreman, observing from afar, felt the shift in energy. Even the guards, unaware of what had transpired fully, moved with a subtle respect born of recognition. Something had changed that could not be reversed. The young man lay that night on his cot, exhausted yet undefeated. He had survived the impossible. He had mastered endurance, adaptation, and influence. The system, once absolute, had revealed its greatest weakness. It could not control what it could not see, could not punish what it could not trace, and could not erase a mind prepared beyond its measures. The plantation would continue its work. The administrator would return, trying new methods, but the variable could no longer be removed. Influence had multiplied, quietly, invisibly, inevitably. He had turned observation into power, patience into strategy, endurance into mastery. And in that moment, he realized the truth that had guided him all along. Survival is not merely about obeying or hiding. Survival is about understanding, anticipating, and moving unseen until the decisive moment. The system had tried to break him. It had failed, and the boy, once declared unfit for reproduction, had become something the system could neither predict nor suppress. He was no longer surviving. He was prevailing. And the story, long and harrowing, had reached its inevitable conclusion. In a world built on control, awareness is the ultimate rebellion.